Today we're going to be talking about saving and preserving your family heritage, like photographs, film, scrapbooks, and family books and Bibles. So who are we? Beth, do you want to go first?
Sure. There's a little blurb up on your screen. I am the collections conservator for the University of Iowa Libraries. That means mostly my job is gluing books back together and making boxes. I serve special collections and the University Archive, as well as the John Martin Rare Book Room, which has a really great collection of medieval medical texts. So if you guys haven't been over there or seen those, I recommend that. I think Damien, the curator there, is putting on some stuff, programs. And I also work a lot with the students here, which is a really great aspect of my job.
And I'm Liz Reardon. I'm the Outreach and Engagement Librarian for Special Collections. And I work a lot with students and donors every day, talking about their material, the material that we have here. And my main job is to basically share our stories with the greater community and let people know what special collections and archives have. And hopefully get people interested to come and visit us, because we are open to the public, we're open to campus. Everyone is allowed to come in and share in these wonderful materials. So that's the bulk of my job. Today we're just going to go briefly over some things that you can do to protect some books, photographs, scrapbooks, textiles, maybe a couple other things that we forgot to list right there. But again, we'd also like to hear from you if you have examples you want to talk over with us. At the end, we'll take some questions here about specific items you might have as well. So we're going to start off with books, and I'm going to turn this over, obviously, to Beth, because this is her job.
So often, I'm coming into this presentation with some assumptions. So again, like Liz mentioned, please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask questions or interject anything. A lot of the questions that we get from the community is about books and about older books. And usually what I see is what people are concerned with are things that are really not that bad. So for instance, this volume, although that spine is coming off, and you can see that joint where the front cover meets the spine looks broken. That's true, but the text block is sound. And this is something that, like, if this was my book, I might do a very minimal fix, or I might do nothing. In the collection, kind of the same thing. So one of the goals of repair is really dependent on your intention with that item. So what you want to think about is, do you intend that book for daily use? Are you going to be handling it a lot? Is it something that you want to hand down and give stays within the family? Is it something that you want to leave on display? Is it something that you would consider for eventual donation? Because those four scenarios would result in maybe slightly different repair scenarios. Very important here at the bottom is, in any of those, please don't use tape.
We'll get to that in a second.
We'll get to that, but this is like tape to a conservator is like the worst thing, just the worst.
We have gotten books donated to us that have been put back together with duct tape before.
Yeah.
And then we always kind of cry on the inside.
Yeah,
when we see
I have some examples I'll show you guys later.
But we did want to show a couple examples on our PowerPoint here of some things that we do come across and talk about a little bit what you might do with them.
So this is a Torah from a local congregation that was donated to IWA. And this has great value for the institution. It has great sentimental value. In this particular instance, if you had like a family Bible or another large volume like this at home that was in similar shape, this is something that I would recommend to actually take to a conservator, and that's because this will have to be resewn. But in the meanwhile, you can see Liz is like circling the broken sewing structure. In the meanwhile, you can still handle this volume. You can leaf through it. It would be totally fine. You would just want to make sure that the parts are kept together and that they're kept in order. Resewing is very time consuming, and it takes some specific knowledge of sewing structure. So it's not something I would recommend to DIY. It's something that I would like save up for and do.
With a professional.
With a professional. Otherwise, this is something that you could actually house in a box, and it would serve that volume very well for probably 50 plus years, honestly, sitting in an enclosure.
So what type of box would you use? Are they're special boxes?
There are, I have some links to things that I will send along to you guys to share later. I also have an example that I'll show.
And we can actually show those right now. I think I'm gonna stop sharing real quick and we're gonna switch to our document camera. And Beth is gonna show you a few examples. And if, I hope that's big for everybody. We're gonna make it big for us, okay.
So we might have to pull it up a little bit higher. Yeah, thanks.
Can everyone see that okay?
So this is an example of what we call a drop spine box. And this one is custom made. We make ours here. And there are people in Iowa City who would make custom drop spine boxes. And this is made of a board that's a lot like the book board, and then it's covered in book cloth, which is cotton or linen. After that, the glue is allowed to off gas, and it's a very stable glue. So this fits this volume very well, very tightly. Thanks, Liz. Mm-hmm. And you can see it's to the exact dimensions of the book.
So that's something you could have professionally done.
Yeah. There are other options that I can, like I mentioned, I'll send a link with vendors where it wouldn't be something specific to that volume, but you could like outfit it a little bit with foam or tissue so that it fit the book a little bit better. But I think this is a very nice option.
You want to show some quick examples?
Yes. So a couple of examples of the tape and why not to use it. So here's a volume. You can see where the spine deteriorated, and somebody put this back together with tape. However, as the adhesive starts to deteriorate and fail, it doesn't really do any support anymore. And a lot of the leather has come off onto the tape. Well, some of it has stayed. And so this creates an extremely time-consuming repair to get the tape off. So if you have a volume like this at your home, which maybe even looks like this one, which somebody used like that athletic tape, or like, you know, I think I have some of this in my house at home in my medicine cabinet. This staining is really incredibly difficult and time consuming to remove. Like this area would take approximately 20 hours to remove that. So if you have something like this in your house, this is something like, if you want to keep it, but not necessarily handle it, you could have a box made for it. If you want to carry it in transit, this is an ace bandage. You know, you can get them for like $3 or something at CVS. And we use these a lot in conservation. And if you want to just keep it together and you're going to like carry it to somebody's house, or you're going to carry it to a conservator, you can just wrap it in one of these tightly. It's kind of a crazy thing, but we do really use these.
This is a question for me, but could you wrap it and then store it in a drawer or something, or would you not leave it wrapped in that?
You can, because these are breathable, you can totally leave it wrapped in this and store it in a drawer. So I would just wrap it once or twice around, maybe not like in a small book the full time. You could, cut it so it would fit. Because if you put it in something that's like plastic, then you run the risk of the item like condensation forming and then mold forming. So something like this, which is breathable, would be great. There's also, I think on the Torah, if you noticed, there was an area that had a stain on it. And a lot of times the stains look really bad but aren't going to be cleaned up. So something that you can do at home to see if the stain will come off without abrading the surface is this is a special kind of sponge. You see it at Ace. Sometimes it is for like, I forget what they call it, but it's sold as something for getting pet hair off your couches. It's a vulcanized rubber sponge. It also is supposed to be used like after a fire when the soot builds up. But we use it, and I would actually cut this up to use it upstairs in the conservation lab. And so let's pretend this has a stain. I would very carefully, or accumulated dust, very carefully, very short strokes, just use this. And you can, I don't know if you can see, there's a little bit of debris on this. So this is really soft. This works really great and is not very invasive. Another cleaning technique is just a really soft brush. So you can walk into Dick Blick and pick out a brush that's pretty soft to the touch. This is a special paste brush, but it doesn't really matter. You can get one with natural fibers or one with nylon fibers as long as it's giving. And we use these to brush the text blocks. This is what I would use also if a book has a lot of debris on it. Also, if a book is moldy, I would use either one of these items. I would go outside in the sun and get rid of the mold from the surface this way with either the brush or that sponge. Yeah, so I was hoping to find a volume with red rot. So if you have older leather books, this side is suede. The leather has deteriorated so much. But so red rot is, if you can see this dust on my fingers, they call it red rot because it's the leather is deteriorating. And it leaves this residue on your fingers. And if you leave it on your bookcase, it leaves it on other books and everything else. So the thing about red rot is that it is not, oh, I should leave this one up. Yeah, sorry. The thing about red rot, you can see it's accumulated here. It's not reversible. So even in the lab, we tend to do treatment that isn't intensive, but just maintains. So, you know, in a home collection, what you could do is, depending on the value of the item, you could sort of use an oil. People use oil. We don't use it at the lab because it could stain the text block. We would use an adhesive over the surface. And this is also what we would use instead of tape. So I'll talk a little bit about that actually now. So when I said that, you know, don't use tape, and you're like, well, what do I use instead? I think a box is a really good solution. The Ace bandage is kind of a great temporary solution. If you're a handy person and you've done a lot of crafting, and honestly, if you have a book that you want to experiment a little bit on, what we use in the lab is, so I mentioned this adhesive, and I can send links. There are two, the important thing about adhesives that you use is that you actually want them to be reversible. And you want them to be, you want them to not degrade. So the two things that we use are one called methyl cellulose, and the other one is a wheat starch paste.
Where do you buy those?
So I will send an Amazon link.
Amazon, okay.
You can buy them from Amazon. I will say these things are expensive. Methyl cellulose for like a 1 ounce or 2 ounce, I think runs about $10. So compared to like Elmer's, you're really paying for it. And the same thing with the wheat starch. The methyl cellulose comes and you can just use it straight. The wheat starch comes in a powder form. It's kind of like cream of wheat, you know? So it's the same thing. It's a very refined starch. You mix it with water and you cook it. Like we would cook it in a microwave. So that's why actually the methyl cellulose is really nice, I think, because it comes and you don't have to do anything to it. And you can also use it to treat red rot. So we use this extremely lightly with a brush. And you can see this is kind of like, I don't know, oatmeal. I guess I might be hungry because I keep saying things like,
I was
oatmeal.
like, this doesn't look like oatmeal to me at all, but that's
the consistency is like, it's thicker than heavy cream.
Yeah.
And so you would want to just dab along the edges there.
Where the book is fraying.
Where the book is fraying. And then let it dry. Now, I will caution you, this does change the color of the material. And I'll have to look at the methyl cellulose on Amazon. It's usually alcohol-based, not water-based. So sometimes it can have an intense smell, but it's also somewhat dehydrating. So when you add it to the surface, especially of leather or suede, it can fundamentally change the color. So whenever we go to treat red rot, the first thing we do is take an inconspicuous area and try it first. But it does basically, I mean, it leaves a layer of glue on top of that leather so that you're not getting that red rot anymore. Well, we're gonna keep moving.
All right. I'm gonna go back to sharing our screen here. And like I said, if you have any questions, we will be taking them afterwards, so don't worry. Photographs though, we all have family photographs that we want to preserve. I know I do, and there's a lot of hard choices when it comes to photographs. This is a photo of a dog dressed up as a person that we have in one of our collections, and I just wanted to share it because it brings me a lot of joy, and everyone needs joy on Fridays, I think. So, but there's a lot of issues that come with photographs, and we're going to start with one that maybe a lot of you have run into, these very long vertical photographs, usually of army groups or theater groups sometimes come in these long formats. So Beth, do you want to talk about when photos get rolled up?
So when photos get rolled up, and especially photos of this era, they have, when they enroll them and you store them in an attic or a basement, they go through a lot of cycles of humidity and drying out. And so what tends to happen is that they don't want to unfurl. And of course, to identify the item, your instinct is to unroll it. And I would caution you to not do so, or to do so extremely slowly, because you will crack the emulsion in the image. So how we recommend doing it is, I'm going to pretend to roll something up here. No. Do you want to switch it really quick?
Yep.
So we're going to pretend that this is a rolled photograph. And when you go to, if you want to unroll it to identify it, you unroll it really slowly, like an inch at a time. And the other section will roll really quickly. And that's so you can identify it. And you kind of go slowly like that. Now, if you want it to remain unrolled, what I would recommend is look for a couple of really rainy days in August. And if you have a room humidifier, like, you know, the kind that doesn't get hot, you could humidify a room, and there are a couple of rainy days in August, leave the photograph out on a table, and it will slowly start to relax. And don't force it. It could take 3 or 4 days. And that's kind of the home version of what we do in the lab. After it won't really lie flat even after that 3 or 4 days. And what you want to do is just take something light on it. This is actually remay or spun polyester. If you go to a farm and fleet, it's what's sold as row cover. And this is great because photograph surfaces don't stick to it when they're wet. And so as it's unfurling, you can lay this over it. And then, you know, maybe to help it stay flat, you can place something really light. You don't need a heavy book. We use a piece of thin plexi. Something like a piece of MDF, but no more weight than that could be placed on it in sections. And then honestly, we leave photographs that we want to be flat under this sort of restraint for like 3 months before they really start laying flat. But, you know, it's kind of the low effort way of doing it.
So with photographs, you know, we're learning more. I'm learning more and more about the medium myself in my job. It's always been a media that I've really appreciated. And so when it comes to photographs, what you're looking at is a bunch of layers of different chemicals binding together to keep this image on a surface, whether that's paper or plastic or what have you. And because you're dealing with something that is made up of lots of chemicals, sometimes the chemicals are unstable. Sometimes when, like with older photographs like you see over here, maybe the chemicals weren't applied right, which will damage the photos or make them fade faster. And so there's only so much you can do to help preserve those photographs. And with black and white photographs, they're actually a lot more stable than color photographs. And they don't deteriorate as quickly as some of the photographs that you see from the 60s and 80s. So color photographs, a lot of them, like I have a ton of these in my families from the 60s and 80s, and you're gonna notice fading in like where something kind of has more of a blue tint. You see the one in the bottom corner here, it has more of a pinkish tint. And that's because certain colors in that photograph are fading because the chemicals aren't as stable. And really, the only thing you can really do at this point is kind of freeze them. There's no stopping color fading. The best you could do is digitize the items and then try to fix the color electronically. When it comes to photos deteriorating, and we'll show you some live examples here in just a second, there's just no stopping the chemical breakdown. And so the way to slow it down though is to put them at what degrees?
I would say even cool, it doesn't necessarily need to be frozen, but if you have like an old refrigerator that you're not using at like 40 degrees is a great temperature, down to I think maybe 25 is what they recommend.
And I know that's a lot to ask, and people don't want to store their photos in a freezer or a fridge, and I get that. So if you don't have that option, making sure that they're in a dark and cool place is really important.
Not your attic.
Not your attic, not your basement. It's usually better to store photos and books and things like that that are very important to you, documents and things like that, on the first floor of your house. And preferably in an area that you check enough. So like sometimes my mom is guilty of this. She has a bunch of our photos in a closet that she forgot about. And then when we went, we noticed that bugs had gotten to them. Not that our house is unclean, but you know, bugs get in certain places and things like that. And so like you want to make sure you're checking your material and being like, okay, so no rodents have gotten to it, no mice. But yeah, attics and basements are big no-nos.
Yeah. But the other thing too, I was gonna say is, you know, that's, if you want to keep them on display, that's fine. Just remember that they'll fade. And if it's something that you do want to hand down, I would recommend displaying a copy. And then I personally use a safety box at my bank because the stability is more important even than the temperature. And though at the safety, those boxes at the bank are incredibly stable environments.
Right. And then sometimes you have rare examples where you might have most of the photographs that we have now are on paper or plastic backings, like that's the main material. But sometimes you'll come across glass plate negatives, tintypes, ambrotypes, and daguerreotypes, which are all older formats of photography, and we'll show you a couple examples. And those are also one-of-a-kind pieces. And again, you know, especially with daguerreotypes, which are on a silver, that's a silver coated copper piece. When air hits it, it oxidizes, and so you'll start to see that the silver starts to tarnish, and that's the big danger with items like this. So we're going to stop again sharing. No one's getting a little sick.
Going back.
So you'll notice that Beth didn't wear gloves when handling the books, and that's actually, we get this question all the time. When handling books and paper, you don't typically wear gloves because you lose dexterity in your fingers and you're more likely to actually rip a page. So that's different though when it comes to photographs. When handling photographs, we try to wear gloves because our oils from our skin here could actually damage the image here and leave. So here we have a tin. I'm gonna hold it up a little bit. Here we have a tin type, and it's in this little paper cover, and you can tell a little bit. She's got rosy cheeks. Someone went in and hand colored the cheeks on this little baby, which is adorable. Tin types are on tin. You can see the backing here. The biggest threat with tin types that you have if you have any, is that the image could chip away from the tin that it's on. And so you just want to be really careful that you're storing these with some kind of protective layer and not just throwing them in a drawer, again, like my mother does. And that you're trying to keep sure that there's like either a piece of paper or some kind of like the fabric that Beth showed you a little bit ago when talking about the large photographs. With black and white photos, so one area that you can see that there's deterioration. So you'll notice that there's kind of like, it's called silver toning, I think is what it's called, when the dark area of a black and white photo kind of has a sheen to it. And you can kind of see that on here, where it kind of looks like it's a bluish silvery tone to it. And that's the image deteriorating, the chemicals breaking down a little bit. And so this is something, again, where we want to make sure we stored it somewhere that's cool and that the temperatures don't fluctuate crazy. I mean, we live in Iowa. That's a constant concern with us, right? It is one of our biggest challenges.
I just wanted to make sure you guys knew that it's been about 25 minutes.
Okay, we got it. We'll keep going.
We got it.
You know, and again, here's that color photograph. You can see it's starting to fade a little bit. And again, the best thing to do if you want to correct the image, you can't correct this image, but you can digitize it and get someone to help you correct the coloring so that it's better on the computer. And then I just wanted to show, a lot of us have cabinet cards of ancestors that come on, and you can see they've got the name of the photographer here at the bottom. And photographs are so complex that there's different things. So it's called binders that keep the image attached to, say, the cardboard or the hard paper that it's on. When you have one that's yellowed like this, it's actually an egg white, and I can never say the word, albumin.
Yeah, you did it.
There we go. That's like aluminum for some people. So, and it gives it a kind of a yellow casting to the image. Collodion is another type of binder that keeps the image on the surface here. And you can tell you have a collodion print if it gives off an iridescent sheen, if it's really shiny. Collodion is great because they actually hold up, I think, better than any other older photograph.
Yeah.
And then when you get into the 20th century, black and white, what you're seeing is a gelatin binder that keeps the image onto the paper or the plastic. And so gelatin is what dominates the 20th century, but gelatin breaks down. So the thing with photographs, and Beth made this important, is that you have to decide what's more important to you, right? And if you want to display them, I fully support displaying them and display copies if you want. But usually trying to keep them as cool as possible and in constant, same kind of temperature is important. Beth has another example. Sometimes colored photographs aren't what they appear.
Yeah. So you're talking about colored photographs and how they fade. This is actually a photograph of my grandmother, she's the one in the white dress, from when she was a kid, so mid-20s, 1920s. And you can see the colors here are very vibrant. So hand-colored photographs are extremely popular from like 1900 to almost the 40s, I think, in the US. And what they use to color the images can vary. Sometimes it's oil paint, sometimes it's watercolor or dyes. If they're aniline dyes, they're extremely stable. And so these actually look great. What you do see with these is, of course, as you can see in the photograph of my grandmother, is you have other issues like the emulsion cracking along a line here, and a little bit of deterioration of the emulsion. You can see it kind of in the background of the greens a little bit.
So that's that silver kind of.
Yeah, you can see that a
Tony.
little bit. Yeah. But these are pretty stable otherwise. When Liz was talking about the gelatin and the collodion, I did want to mention that photographs, when they're humid, of course, they can like curl and flatten, but they can also develop mold on the surfaces. And if you come across a photo that is moldy or has a lot of dirt on it, I don't use that vulcanized sponge on them. It has a small amount of sulfur in it. And sulfur actually really deteriorates photographs extremely quickly. So, plus it's somewhat more abrasive. So you want to just use this soft brush again and brush any mold away from the surface.
I said I was going to share an example of a daguerreotype. So I got this on, someone was just selling it online and I picked it up. But you can see there's a crack right here in the lid. So a lot of daguerreotypes, tintypes, and ambrotypes come in these beautiful cases. When you open them up, there's like a velvet cushion on one side and then the image on the other. And so you'll notice that this case actually is several layers, and that's what's protecting the image from tarnishing. And because there's a hole right in the case, you can see it correlates with where the image is now starting to tarnish. Because some of that protection is gone.
The other thing I've seen in these is, especially when they're no longer housed.
No.
Okay, especially when they're no longer housed in this case, is the glass breaks, or people remove it from this metal
Frame kind of
thing. And I would say, really don't do that.
No, this is literally what's keeping the air out, and you don't want air touching these items because that's what tarnishes them. So, all right, moving along. We promise we'll get through this. Okay, scrapbooks. A lot of people also have scrapbooks, and they pose an interesting challenge in themselves. A lot of fun. I love scrapbooks, but I also understand that they can be a huge problem here in the archives anyway.
So the scrapbooks, you want to think of them as complex objects. So, the word collage in there was chosen very purposefully. There's so many different materials that go into the scrapbooks, and you need to think of the scrapbook as a whole item, not necessarily as a book. So the book is really secondary. That case is really secondary to the preservation of the scrapbook as a whole. You can see a very common problem here, this sort of football shape, when the spine is narrower than the rest of the text block. And you just want to be careful handling these books. They often have very brittle substrate paper, the paper that everything is glued onto. And with all of this stuff glued onto that paper, you just have a tendency for those papers to break at the joint. If I had a volume like this, I would even consider unscrewing it in order to lessen the damage done at the joints and make handling a lot easier.
Take some of that pressure off those pages. Yeah.
So, yeah.
I feel like the moral of this whole presentation is just don't use adhesives. Like,
scrapbooks, right? Like everybody's using different glues. The glues that are often used are animal-based in these, and you can see that yellow staining in the upper right-hand corner. It's not necessarily a failure. What's great about that is that when it failed, it came off cleanly. So if you want to re-adhere things, I would use that methyl cellulose again. And I would not necessarily re-adhere photographs. And with papers, I might just re-adhere in the corners, something to make it stay in the place, but not necessarily like that whole paste down, like you can see in that right area. That's a huge area that was pasted down. That's not really necessary. So the other issues that come up that are problems that once they happen, you can't really reverse, but you can keep it from happening. So my finger in the middle picture is pointing to what's called cross-linking. So this is a chemical reaction that is happening between the adhesive and the paper. Those are no longer two things, they are one thing, and you won't be able to remove this paper or stop its degradation. It's going to continue to brown like that. The best thing that you can do is, if the glue is brittle, try and remove it from the back very lightly with like a little scraping tool. In the upper right-hand corner, you can see some discoloration on the photograph, and the same thing where it says AT&T, you see discoloration. This is from acid migration. So what that means is the page following those images is poor quality paper, and the acid that's in that paper has moved and changed the color onto those items. The best way to deal with that, especially photographic materials, is just put a neutral paper in between those two pages. That's all you have to do.
Yeah, so a lot of scrapbooks, what make them so tricky is it's photographs and other ephemera mixed in with newspaper clippings, and newspapers have to be made of the worst paper ever created.
They had to be cheap.
They had to be cheap, right? Because they were mass produced. And so it's super acidic and will transfer onto a lot of things. So black paper scrapbooks, these are really popular in the 30s and 40s. And this is what a lot of my family owns. This is why I wanted to talk about it, because I'm sure some of you also have these. The big question, I mean, the black paper that these are on are also incredibly acidic.
Yeah. So we call that an inherent vice. So the paper itself really is the problem, and it can't necessarily be fixed. We get a lot of these, I get a lot of these as referrals, where there's a lot of chipping on the page, and there's really not much that can be done that's a long-term solution.
And so like the big question that comes with these then is like, do you take the photographs out? A lot of these scrapbooks have little sayings written underneath them. I've come across some that have beautiful drawings on the black paper that accompany the photos. So how do you capture those captions or those illustrations that go along with the photos? And again, you could try to leave the book together as much as possible and just understand that the paper will deteriorate over time. Or again, you could try to scan the pages. We've got scanners here at the library that you could use down on the first floor. I'm sure there's other institutions and other places, the public library might be able to help you as well, to scan these images so you can keep the intact object as a whole, and then take the photos out later and put them in a more stable environment. So this is when we say it gets really messy, because it's always hard to say, this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do, because it really is up to you on a case by case what you feel about the item, right?
Yes. So magnetic scrapbooks. So the adhesive on these, I don't know if you can tell in the picture on the right, in raking light, you can sort of see the adhesive is applied in strips, so you can see it in diagonal lines.
It's right on the page, yeah.
These are terrible. So if you have any in your home now, my advice to you is rehome the items in these scrapbooks. So what happens is the adhesive becomes really thick and tar-like, and so it's really difficult to remove items, or it becomes brittle and breaks and the items fall out. Often that sheet that you see right there is PVC, and so when it breaks down, it off-gases and it changes the emulsion on a photograph, changes the color. It can degrade the photo.
So like here on the left, you see how wrinkly that plastic is, and that's because that plastic is breaking down and it's attaching itself to that photograph.
Yeah.
And so when you try to peel that plastic back, it is likely to take a piece of that photograph with it.
Yeah, so the first step I would say is don't Don't buy them.
I think you can still buy them, so please don't.
Yeah. So what I would do if I had these is I would take a micro spatula and just, move the items from this into another scrapbook or into a shoebox so that they're still together. And sometimes that will have to be done extremely carefully so that you don't break the item.
I've also heard of using dental floss.
Yeah.
To kind of do a saw-like motion. So you take a piece of dental floss and you find a corner of the photo and very slowly in a saw-like motion, try to get it up. Now, sometimes you can't get the items off that page. The adhesion has already become tar, right? The best you can do is take that plastic off though, and at least get the plastic off and then put, like Beth has said before, a neutral piece of paper on top and at least have some paper on top instead of this nasty plastic. I have a lot of these in my family too, and every time I see them, I want to cry.
Okay, so textiles. This is actually my daughter on a quilt that my grandmother made me. And so the big thing with textiles and quilts in particular, or like really giant dresses, is the less folding that you can do, the better for that item. For this particular quilt, I think it's folded in half where I have it stored. I've also rolled it onto a really large diameter tube, like a 5-inch tube, with a cotton sheet in it to give it support and protect it.
Does it matter what color of cotton sheet?
I use a white one.
Just a white one?
Yeah. So here's another quilt.
These are called crazy quilts, and they have their own challenges because it's a lot of different fabrics put together, so they can kind of rub on each other and tear easily. But it's the same thing that you were saying.
Yeah, the folding again, try to avoid the folding. The one thing that I heard from a quilt maker and who now works at a quilt museum, a great piece of advice she gave is if you can store it flat, like if you have a spare bed, store all of your quilts flat, layer them up, again, use a sheet in between them and just lay them flat, put a sheet on top so the sun doesn't damage the material, especially if they're older quilts. And that's really great. Otherwise, if you have them folded, what we're supposed to recommend is that you unfold it and refold it on a monthly basis, which is pretty intense. And I would say if you can do that once a year, just so that where the folds are, cotton and linen will deteriorate. If there are silk threads, it will deteriorate also at the fold. So that's why we recommend refolding and then and always with a support material like a quilt or like a sheet of cotton. Yep.
Sometimes you get textiles that are folk art. This is actually part of your family's stuff, right?
Yeah. So this is a complex item. It's all textiles, but really it has the same problems as quilts or handmade dolls. So the batting used inside on the woman's dress is wool, and it's a proteinaceous material that will attract pests. You have silk threads that make the image, that sort of delineate that line around the, kitchen or living room, the window. With this was stored and it was hung in a room. And so it has some color fading issues. That's real hair, by the way, on that guy's head stitched into place, which also attracts pests. And so if you have an item like this, or even some quilts might have, wool batting, you just want to monitor for pest damage. And my recommendation is to really limit the amount. Like I wouldn't wash this. I wouldn't even wash this by hand anymore. You can see that the velvet, the nap is really degrading. I would take a very soft brush. I say this all the time. I'm sure that you're getting tired of the soft brush thing, but I would take a really soft brush and not vacuum directly on the surface, but I would brush and hold a vacuum end about 4 inches away from this item and brush into that vacuum end in order to clean it. I'm myself will be looking at like getting this matted and framed by a professional, because I do want to display it.
So again, we already showed you a box, and I know we're running out of time and we want to make sure to take any of your questions. So Beth, you do have a document that you'll send to Amy, who can send out to everybody here.
Yeah. It will have a couple of vendors. So for boxes, it will also have local people that you can ask for help either treating an item or like we call it a referral list. So not just books, but photographs or textiles or paintings. And like I'll share that.
Yeah, and so the cost can vary. Like sometimes boxes can be rather expensive, especially if the item requires special housing. Like this one is a miniature book, and so it needs extra foam. It needs a little tab to help get it out of the foam. Things like that might cost you a little bit more than a simple maybe 4-flat box or things like that. So that was a really, really quick rundown of different things that you can do, but we are here. Well, not that quick, that's also true. But we are here to take any questions.
I'm hoping some of you guys have specific items.
And we'll try to
have questions about.
Aha, there it is. Yeah. There we are.
There we are. Oh, it's a lot closer this time.
Yeah. So does anyone have any questions that we can help answer? We've got more items if you just want to look at items under the dock camera and we can talk about them. Didn't even pull the scrapbook.
I have a question.
Yeah, Carol.
I have a lot of those plastic inserts. They're pretty new, where you put the scrapbook page on the you mount your photos on the scrapbook page, and then you insert it into the plastic. Is that a good thing or no?
So it depends on what type of plastic it is. Some of them are polyethylene or polypropylene, and those are both recommended materials. If it doesn't say that and it's vinyl or PVC, it isn't a long-term solution.
So I bought these at a craft store, and it's especially for scrapbooking, and the pages are acid-free.
Yeah.
So I think that they are designed for.
Yeah. So sometimes when people say acid-free, it is a bit of a misnomer. And with photographs, it's important that it's a neutral pH, but you also want to make sure that it's not a buffered paper, because a buffered paper so like where the pH is 8 or 9, can shift blues in particular. And
so what should you look on packaging then?
So I would say lignin-free is a more important thing to look for than even the word archival. Like these things are marketed at
right? L-I-G.
L-I-G-N, yes. Well, there's an N in there, L-I-G-N-E-N.
Oh,
sorry.
Oh,
okay, so I see another,
what do you suggest to use to write names on back of photos? Which is a fabulous question.
And I have links to those items. So if you walk into Dick Blick, you can get pencils, which are a 6B lead. And that's what I would recommend, a softer pencil than you're used to using. If you want to use something like darker, because the soft pencil can smudge a little bit. If you're going to be handling that a lot, on the back of the photo, you can use a micron. It's a pigment pen. It's kind of similar to a thin Sharpie. Don't use a Sharpie though. Sharpies fade.
Well, yeah, and you just don't want to use Sharpie.
And you don't want to use Sharpie anyway. But those are the two things that I would use, and I am happy to send that link along. So and then Dick Blick also carries those micron pigment pens in stock there. And they come in several colors, so you don't have to just use black.
E6 lead, right?
6B.
6B, okay. We got another question about old newspapers from World War II, not in the best of shape and crumbly. What's the best way to stop deterioration at that point?
So the best thing to stop deterioration is if it's really, really crumbly. So people used to do like acid wash, like where they would take out the acids. I wouldn't recommend doing that at home, especially if the paper's already crumbly. You'll see spray cans of like buffer material. I also would caution against that. If the old newspaper is already deteriorating, the best thing that you can actually do is put it into a dark place. Once the acidity has started in paper, it's not really reversible, sadly.
So it's more about just housing it and making sure it doesn't rapidly deteriorate anymore.
If it's something that you want to store and keep, I would recommend putting it in something like this, this is a Mylar L sleeve, and Mylar is like you could put. I'm going to put the photo in here. You could put the newspaper in there, and it's clear, and you can read it. It won't stop deterioration, but you can handle it without damage that way. And we do that for a lot of materials. It's a good thing to store photos in as well. So if you want to write Mylar sleeves, and then I have a link for those. I'll send those in a document. MYLAR. Yes.
I'm not a good speller, folks, so I'll admit that. Mylar sleeves, yeah, that's something else that you could buy online as well too, right?
Yeah, so Carol, I also have, it's not for the scrapbook sheets full, but I do have a link to a vendor that has the polypropylene sleeves that you can put into a 3-ring binder for photographs. They probably have something that's a full sheet size too for scrapbooks. And those are definitely polypropylene.
Yeah, I'll check to see what these are. These are the 12 by 12. I think they're 12 by 12 or those large pages.
Yeah.
From like Michael's or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, sadly, without seeing the thing in front of me, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Check and see what the composition of that is.
Yeah.
I have another a question that goes in a different direction.
Sure.
But I bet other people on this call would want to know this. So I have a lot of family memorabilia, including photos and a few books and just general old stuff. So these, and I have this sense of being the caretaker of these things while I'm alive. So being a senior, I am concerned about what I should do with these things. I have 2 children. I don't think they care at all about having this stuff, but I don't want it to just get thrown in a dumpster someplace. So my family is from Jasper County, Monroe area near Des Moines. So my thought was to designate the stuff that I think that they probably won't want and ask them to take it to the Jasper County Historical Society and see if they can use it.
That's a great idea. I think, if you have family papers that are specific to a certain area in Iowa, looking for the state, like that county historical society is always a great place to start. And then, because they usually want material that has to do with their county. They're always looking for that kind of stuff. And then, other institutions and there's other museums, so the State Historical Society of Iowa, we take in papers that fit our collection as well. But yeah, make sure you're, I think sometimes, I get this a lot from my parents. They're like, you don't want this. And I'm like, yes, I do. So, I think sometimes your kids can surprise you, but if they don't, there is always different groups that you can look into. And like, if maybe your high school, sometimes high schools have their own archives as well, or their own colleges. Like
I was gonna say small colleges. Like, so if you have a lot of one particular family member stuff who went to a smaller college, that would be a good location. The one thing I will say about giving to a historical society is that you probably want to donate things that are in really good shape.
Yeah.
Because funding at a historical society is difficult. And so that's something to consider. And then also, while you have it, if photographs aren't labeled, go ahead and label them.
Please label, yeah, like pictures are kind of worthless when they come to an archives and we don't know who they are in the photos a little bit. So labeling the back of photos is so important before you do any donation. Just because people want to know who they are, and
So I have a bunch of tintype era things. So what do you put, what kind of a label or what material do you use for a label to put on that?
sometimes just having a piece of paper with the item, because you can't obviously write on the back of a tintype, right? Like we get that. And so having documentation with that item stored in the sleeve with it, if you have it in a sleeve.
I would say if you have, like 10 tintypes and you know who those people are, just have a document that says, this one at this dimension, this male or female in the photo, this is who it is. Just a list like that would be sufficient.
Baby with rosy cheeks. That's
Baby with rosy cheeks.
Grumpy old man. That's a lot of my family photo. Like which person is this?
Yeah.
Why do they look so similar?
And I'll also echo Liz in double checking, because although my father and my aunt didn't want any of my grandparents' stuff, I am now the person in the family who is yeah, I'll take that.
Yep.
I have all of that stuff.
Yeah. So
It's like you need to have a whole room of your house dedicated to your own family history stuff.
Yes, you do.
Yes.
My grandfather lived in a farmhouse that had been in his side of the family for 180 years, which, as you can imagine, accumulated so many things. And it really, I was like, I don't know how anybody without that house could store it,
Yep. It's a museum in its own self. Yeah. All right, we have another question. I took a picture of items and wrote a little description of the history and any memories that I might have of them. And then put it in a notebook for my kids. That's a great idea. That's from Karen. So yes, I know a lot of people are starting to put together, like Carol, you mentioned scrapbooks with family photos, but writing down your memories and things like that, and leaving it to the next generation so they understand why you kept this photograph for so long or why this was important to your family.
We actually did audio interviews and tapes with my grandfather in the late 80s, which are now of great sentimental value, of course, but they're also just really fascinating. That I think we'll probably end up donating to institutions.
So, and that we're out of time, but audio and film, we didn't even get to that, but that's a whole other kettle of fish. You'll have to bring us back, Amy, for that one, because that's a whole other thing. We got one more minute left. Does anyone have any final questions? Carol?
I have, among all this other stuff, I have a safety deposit box, at home fire safe, I guess is what they're called, that I've got a whole bunch of those really ornate photo thing, kind of like what you had shown that has the tintypes in them that are mounted. So, and I have one that's really ornate, and then I have a bunch of little ones with individual pictures in them with a little hook on the side to close them. If I wanted to have those pictures in a scrapbook, how do I get them off of the mounting page? Because they're stuck pretty tight. Or is that something I shouldn't be doing?
Probably not, but are you in Iowa City, Carol?
Coralville.
Okay, so feel free to reach out and email me, because I could take an eyeball on what those things are and then give you really specific advice about that. Okay. What I have done with some of my family's old ambrotypes and tintypes is have them imaged and then reprint those so that we have copies to share and keep.
Yeah.
So you don't disturb the little photo book.
Are you talking like these little books?
Yeah, the one I have one that's about 5 by 7. That's the one that's really ornate.
Yeah.
And it has pictures of some people I know and some people I don't. I think there's a photo of Abraham Lincoln in there.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, don't take it out of it.
Yeah, don't. And a fun about these little cases. Sometimes the case is worth hundreds of dollars alone without the photograph.
Right, especially those more ornate ones.
Yeah, so sometimes the really ornate ones are worth actually a lot of money. So that's something else to consider when you're dealing with photographs that come in these cases.
Okay, I'm gonna make an appointment to see you all.
I think you should.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah, any last minute? Amy, I think we've run out your clock.
Yeah.
That's okay.
And again,
Thank
I
you.
encourage anybody to send some emails with follow-up questions, or if I forget to send a link of something that I mentioned, please follow up.
Yeah, Amy, are you good if we get you that and you'll send it?
Yes, I will forward it to our list, email list, and include the recording of this so folks can reference. And then definitely include Elizabeth and Beth's emails. And thank you everybody for joining us today. Next week, we'll have somebody else from the University of Iowa, Amanda Lensing, who will be talking about still life and art. So looking forward to that. And thank you all again for coming. And we'll hopefully see you all next week and bring back some Elizabeth and for audio and
And film.
film maybe.
Very, very helpful program. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks everyone for
Yeah,
coming.
thank you.